The book of Numbers, what's presented here is Israel's journey through the wilderness, and it was supposed to be a journey of faith. It was supposed to be a journey where they were facing difficulties that were actually supposed to teach them trust in God. So it was an opportunity for growth, but the nation of Israel is going to struggle with that. And that's what really most of Numbers actually focuses on, is their difficulties with faith, and it starts early. That's what we're going to be looking at today in Numbers chapter 11, because they were looking at the wrong things. We talked last week about how they were supposed to be looking back, but on what God had done to set them free from Egypt, and then looking forward to what he was going to do by giving them their promised land. Instead, they were looking back at the wrong things and weren't really looking forward at all. And as they do that, it provides an example for us. This is what their story does throughout the book of Numbers, really throughout everything that's presented about them in Scripture, is their struggles are a model for understanding and trying to do better ourselves, to know that God does give his people what they truly need. And also, he doesn't ignore their grumbling against him. So we need to be content with what he provides. And as I said, we're going to be in Numbers chapter 11 today. And if you have your Bibles, like I mentioned, today's a good day to use that, to be able to look at that yourself, but also potentially a little bit confusing, so I figured I better state that in the first place. I have a different version, a different translation of the Bible that I'm going to be using for what we're looking at in Numbers today, just because there's a couple different touches that they use. It doesn't make a huge difference, but it was enough I could make a few points about it, and so I wanted to do that. If you're using the New King James that I would normally be reading from, it's going to be a little different from that this time, because I'm using the Christian Standard Bible, their translation. Numbers chapter 11, starting with verse 1. It says, "Now the people began complaining openly before the Lord about hardship. When the Lord heard, his anger burned, and fire from the Lord blazed out among them and consumed the outskirts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and he prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So that place was named Taberah, because the Lord's fire had blazed among them." This little section, we're just going to deal with it real briefly here, because the point is that the Israelites started complaining right out of the gate. In Numbers chapter 10, they had just been 3 days into their journey. But here they are in Numbers chapter 11, and they're already having a problem. We're not told exactly what, just that it was a hardship. They were complaining. It's actually what I ended up titling this slide. You know, are we there yet? Like little kids on a journey. They can't put up with the fact that it's taking more time than they want it to. Seems to be the nature of it. We don't know, again, exactly what, just that it was hard for them. The Lord's not happy to hear that from them for really nothing, and so he responds by sending fiery judgment. But it's just on the outskirts of the camp. There's no mention that anybody was hurt, and so probably nobody was actually by this, which means it was more for the purpose almost of what the burning bush had been, where Moses saw that. It's recorded in Exodus chapter 3, how it was something that was miraculous and spectacular, but also was subtle enough that it could have been ignored. This was that sort of thing. There's enough subtlety to it that it wasn't immediately destructive, especially destructive of life. It was just a kind of a warning shot across the bow. You people need to stop. And so they do kind of stop, and they ask Moses to help them, and Moses is in the gap between Israel and God, and so he does intercede for them and does what we should be doing for people too, by praying for them. That's his response to this, and so God does stop. The fire stops. It's on the outskirts, but it doesn't take them long to cause more trouble, and that's where we really get into the meat of this chapter, which is kind of a pun, as we'll see actually, but in verse 4 of chapter 11, our next slide here, it says, "The riffraff among them had a strong craving for other food. The Israelites wept again and said, 'Who will feed us meat? We remember the free fish we ate in Egypt, along with the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. But now our appetite is gone. There's nothing to look at but this manna.' The manna resembled coriander seed, and its appearance was like that of bdellium. And the people walked around and gathered it, and they ground it on a pair of grinding stones or crushed it in a mortar, and then boiled it in a cooking pot and shaped it into cakes. It tasted like a pastry cooked with the finest oil. When the dew fell on the camp at night, the manna would fall with it. Moses heard the people, family after family, weeping at the entrance of their tents. The Lord was very angry. Moses was also provoked. So Moses asked the Lord, 'Why have you brought such trouble on your servant? Why are you angry with me, and why do you burden me with all these people? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth, so you should tell me, carry them at your breast as a nanny carries a baby to the land you swore to give their fathers? Where can I get meat to give all these people? For they are weeping to me, give us meat to eat. I can't carry all these people by myself. They're too much for me. If you're going to treat me like this, please kill me right now if I have found favor with you, and don't let me see my misery anymore. And so we have what starts here. This is probably the main reason why I chose this translation, like I was talking about, is just the word riffraff, another good word. Because in the New King James, it says mixed multitude. And that does carry, it's an accurate translation, because it's talking about people who were foreigners. That's really, these are outsiders to Israel, and so they're not actually part of the nation. But riffraff is a little bit stronger because it says they're not just outsiders, it says that they're troublemakers. And that's what these people are being. And so they're kind of a counterpoint to what we talked about a little bit last week. We talked about people who could celebrate the Passover, how the Lord had provided that anybody of any nationality could do that if they wanted to honor him for what he had done in saving Israel. And it wasn't just restricted to the Israelites, but that they also had to do it the same way that the Israelites did. These are people who are really trying to be more hangers-on. They left Egypt at the same time that the Israelites did, but didn't actually have a relationship with God and didn't want one. They just thought maybe it was a chance to improve their circumstances a little bit. And so they were always going to be the quickest to complain as well, because they really didn't have any part in God's covenant. And also, because they weren't part of any tribe, that would have meant that they would be camping on the outskirts of the nation, which was, remember, where the fire started in that previous little snippet. And that implies that they were the cause of that trouble too. Again, that we don't know what it is, but here we are told. They're dissatisfied. Even though they weren't Israelites, God was still feeding them. They were getting the manna also, his gift, which was all that they needed to sustain them. They weren't starving, but they were bored. They didn't like the lack of variety, and so they complained about it. And then their complaint quickly infected the Israelites as well. And so they said that they were better off in Egypt with the food that they could get there. And again, wanting variety, it's understandable, but it betrays, as cliche as it is, an attitude of ingratitude. That's what they were doing. They weren't being thankful for what God had provided for them, and were claiming that their situation in Egypt was somehow better than the one they had now, and that the food that they had gotten was free. I mean, well, what you're getting from God's free right now too, but also the only reason it was free is because you weren't being paid anything. They were just keeping you alive to work for them. So it's an insane attitude. But we can kind of share insight as to why they would have taken it up. For one thing, another cliche, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. They knew, as bad as it was, they understood their situation in Egypt. Now they're going into a future they don't really know anything about. And so that comes with a certain amount of fear that we can all experience. For another, even more practical, would you really be any different if you had to eat the same thing every day? You know, I don't. My dog does that. He manages okay. I don't really think that I could all that well. You know, so and I'm sure that there's mention of other things that they did eat, but manna was the staple of their diet, and you could see how you could get sick of anything really if it was the same thing day after day. Third, kind of going to a more philosophical level, freedom is difficult. For them it was new. They're coming out of a circumstance where they had been enslaved for generations, and they're having to learn the ropes of having some autonomy, some ability to make their own decisions, and maybe stretching those muscles a little too hard in a way, but then also kind of talking about the place where they were slaves as having been better. Because even when you have freedom, even when you get used to it, it's difficult to maintain. There is an urge, a kind of, oxymoronic urge, I guess, within us to actually enjoy being told what to do so that we don't have to think for ourselves, so that we don't have to be responsible for ourselves. And so I think there's some of that that's involved in this also. But for me, I think ultimately the most important reason, they didn't want a land that they knew nothing about, which ties into, again, to a future that they didn't really understand. It was promised to their forefathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they had never been there. To them, it didn't mean anything. What they wanted was Egypt, because it was a good land that they already knew. But they didn't really want to be slaves there again. They wanted Egypt for themselves. They wanted God to complete the conquest of Egypt for them that he had started with the plagues, so that they could be in control. So complaining about the manna was actually saying that they didn't trust the Lord's plan altogether. It wasn't good enough for them. And that's what angers the Lord here. Moses doesn't really exactly help the situation here. He is ironically complaining about their complaints because he's sick of it. Sick to death. He asks to die, which, as serious as that is, I couldn't help but laugh because I'm a Looney Tunes fan. Dad raised me to be one, and the only thing I could hear in my head when I was reading this was Daffy Duck shouting, "I demand that you shoot me now!" Because that's pretty much that trick that Bugs Bunny played on him is kind of what Moses sounds like here. And he's being as ridiculous as everybody else, which, yes, he had a great burden to have to carry. But he was not being mindful of who actually did the lifting. And that was what was getting him into trouble. But God responds to this, and everybody gets what they ask for. That's what we find in the next slide in verse 16. It says that the Lord answered Moses, "Bring me 70 men from Israel known to you as elders and officers of the people. Take them to the tent of meeting and have them stand there with you. And then I will come down and speak with you there. I will take some of the Spirit who is on you and put the Spirit on them. They will help you bear the burden of the people so that you do not have to bear it by yourself." And we'll stop there for now before moving on to the next slide. But just for those first couple of verses, God tells Moses to pick 70 elders who will be helpers for him. They'll help with that burden that he's complaining about having to bear. This should remind us of something that happens earlier in Scripture because it's pretty similar to what Jethro told Moses to do. Jethro was Moses' father-in-law, and Moses visited with them on the way to Sinai and was kind of complaining, kind of showing off to some extent, all the work that he had to do as basically the only person in charge of the government of Israel. And so Jethro told him, "You're going to burn yourself out doing that. You need to pick some other people who can help you with that." And so this is like that, but also has some important differences. What Jethro told Moses to do was for administration. It was for government. This advice from the Lord, really command from the Lord, is about spiritual guidance. That's the type of leadership that these elders are supposed to provide. And of course, God is the one telling him directly, whereas what Jethro did was godly advice coming from a human being. But I think both of those things together do tell us something about Moses that's a little bit negative. A lot of what we see about Moses in the Bible is positive, but he's not presented as being perfect. And this is an example of that. Because whether those people that Jethro told him to pick were administrators or not, they should have been people he could have relied on as elders before this point for everything that he needed. The fact that he had to be told to, again, by God, pegs him as a micromanager. He's complaining about having to be in control, but he also needs to be in control. It's kind of the attitude that he's showing here, and that betrays a lack of faith. He didn't believe in them to do it because he didn't believe in God to enable them to do it. And that was causing him problems to where he was at his wit's end. But God is gracious to give him these assistants, and they're going to help from this point forward because God's actually going to inspire them in a similar way to what he's been doing with Moses. But as for the people, God's response is a little bit harsher. That's what we find in our next section, starting in verse 18, the next slide. And there the Lord says, "Tell the people, consecrate yourselves in readiness for tomorrow, and you will eat meat, because you wept in the Lord's hearing. Who will feed us meat? We were better off in Egypt. The Lord will give you meat, and you will eat. You will eat, not for 1 day or 2 days or 5 days or 10 or 20, but for a whole month, until it's coming out of your nostrils and becomes nauseating to you because you have rejected the Lord who is among you and wept before him. Why did we ever leave Egypt?" But Moses replied, "I'm in the middle of a people with 600,000 foot soldiers, yet you say I will give them meat and they will eat for a month. If flocks and herds were slaughtered for them, would they have enough? Or if all the fish in the sea were caught for them, would they have enough?" And the Lord answered Moses, "Is the Lord's arm weak? Now you will see whether or not what I have promised you will happen." And so we'll stop there again for now. And here, God tells Moses to tell the Israelites, all right, an all-you-can-eat buffet. That's what I'll set up. It's going to be more than you can handle. The Lord would give them what they were asking for until it was coming out of their ears or nostrils. For us, it's ears. That's our idiom. It means the exact same thing as what's recorded here. The same idea. That desired meat was going to become more hateful to them than the manna could ever possibly have been. What Dennis Cole calls an oxymoronic wrathful blessing. Because it is a blessing. It's an answer to their prayers. It's food. But it's an expression of curse as God is showing his anger at that attitude that they have of not being content with what he's giving them. But yet, in spite of that answer he provides, we get more out of Moses here. Shows again where he is at this point, because he gets snarky with God. What do you mean you're going to... Luckily for him, though, God he doesn't do anything more than remind him. He wasn't any less powerful than he had been in Egypt. No less powerful than at the Red Sea. He provided the manna every day. And so he would provide the meat, would provide the quail, which is what it actually was. That's what we find in the next section. It starts at verse 31. It says, "A wind sent by the Lord came up and blew quail in from the sea. It dropped them all around the camp. They were flying 3 feet off the ground for about a day's journey in every direction. And the people were up all that day and night and all the next day gathering the quail. The one who took the least gathered 50 bushels, and they spread them out all around the camp. While the meat was still between their teeth, before it was chewed, the Lord's anger burned against the people, and the Lord struck them with a very severe plague. So they named that place Kibroth-Hattaavah, because there they buried the people who had craved the meat. And from Kibroth-Hattaavah, the people moved on to Hazeroth and remained there." So they get the blessing of the quail. And it is exactly what God said he would do. 3 feet deep, as far as the eye could see. Enough that 50 bushels worth was what every family was able to collect. Definitely more than they knew what to do with. And they were going to eat for a while. But as soon as they started, they experienced the curse of the quail. It says that while it was still between their teeth, they were still immediately. They were struck by this plague. And the word actually that's in the original language that's translated plague there does very much suggest an illness, probably food poisoning is most likely here of what they were going through. And if you know anything about dying by food poisoning, I'm not going to get graphic about that, but that is a horrible way, a disgusting way to go. And many people did, because that's what that place name means. Kibroth-Hattaavah, that means graves of craving. They left a lot of people buried there. Now, of course, our question looking at that is why the plague at this point? Because the quail were already supposed to be a sort of a punishment anyway, right? But over an extended period of time. Over a month was what the Lord had said, because they were going to get sick of it, and they were going to wish that they had never asked for it in the first place. And that was actually still going to be the case, but that was in response to their discontent. Being struck down immediately here, that was in response to their greed, because that was what they were showing here. They stayed up a day and a half solid in order to gather in these quail. And also, depending on how you do the counting, and I'm kind of fond of this myself, it seems like that period that they were collecting the quail ran into the Sabbath day. They were probably on a Saturday that they were doing that collecting. So working when they weren't supposed to be, because they didn't trust God to keep the birds there. They figured they had just blown in and they could maybe blow right out, so we better grasp everything we possibly can for ourselves before they're gone. They didn't believe that God would actually keep his word. And that was why, rather than waiting for the whole month, he struck them down right then and there. But once God's judgment was dispensed, the crisis was over. And that's the end of the story. Because we don't get a detail that we will see on more occasions and have seen in the past, and actually saw earlier in this chapter. It's easy to miss because it's not there. But Moses doesn't pray for them. He doesn't ask for the plague to end. He's still in a mood, apparently, at that point. It's just God knows that it's time to be done. He ends it, and then they move on. They take off back on their journey to Canaan. This is a disastrous moment for the nation of Israel, the new nation of Israel, and it won't be the last one, and it won't be the worst one in this book. let alone in the Bible. But for all of them, we have to try to see where they went wrong so that we don't follow them there. That should be the goal. And of course, the details of our lives are not exactly the same, but there are points of commonality that we have to be looking for, starting with avoiding mixed company, or at least understanding mixed company, because it's a little bit tricky. The problem does start with those who didn't have a relationship with God, but God doesn't kick them out. And he doesn't tell the Israelites to kick them out or to not have anything to do with them, because he still wants them to have the opportunity to gain that relationship with him. It's exactly the same for Christians. We can't avoid non-believers. The Apostle Paul speaks to this in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 9 and 10. He says, I wrote to you in my epistle not to keep company with sexually immoral people, yet I certainly did not mean with the sexually immoral people of this world or with the covetous or extortioners or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. And so Paul had provided instruction earlier that Christians were supposed to avoid bad company, but especially when it was with people who called themselves Christians and yet lived for sin, as though it were not, and were not willing to see it as sin, celebrated it. And those are the people who are saying you can't associate with them because you're going to send the wrong message. But I'm not saying to avoid anyone who's a sinner, because that's impossible. You have to be among these people. If you try to separate yourselves from them entirely, you're not going to be reaching out to them with the gospel that they need in order to be saved. And so we can't do that. Instead, we are responsible, as Israel should have been responsible, to not be misled by those people's misguided complaints and behaviors. We are supposed to be above that, not letting that infect us, by being content with the journey that we're on. Of course, Israel was not, and they looked back on Egypt and insanely through these rose-tinted glasses that were telling them that they had been better off there. Is it any less insane for us to look back that fondly on our lives before Christ? Of course, that is what we do. That's even why a lot of people don't come to Christ in the first place, because they know that that would mean there would be a change. And the things that they are chasing now, they wouldn't be or should not be chasing anymore. And those pleasures that aren't actually leading them anywhere good, but that idea of having to separate from those things is what keeps a lot of people really from not becoming Christians, because they don't want to have to admit that there's anything wrong with them and any type of responsibility for them. And even then when we become Christians, we struggle with that continuously. And this is as Christians, not talking about people just playing pretend, but for all of us, we have these difficulties that we have to face of either living wastefully, where we do continue to go after those sins and we have to have that struggle with it that's always going on, or living resentfully, where, yeah, maybe we do separate from a sin, but not because we want to, because we're afraid, because we feel obligated. And then that usually ends up expressing itself in judgmentalism against other people. And so you have this coming from both sides, when really what we're supposed to do is to recognize that the chains of sin were only leading to death, and Christ freed us from those and is leading us into a new life, and that's what we should be rejoicing for, and that is what we should be living out of. If we are more mindful of that, that's going to help us to be content and to be in between the waste and the resentment that are the extremes that we are supposed to avoid. Another thing that we want to avoid is being controlling, like I am suggesting Moses was. His frustration is understandable, I think. I actually think that any of us would do as well as he did. Moses is an incredible character, but that inherent need to be in control of things was not helping him, and it won't help us either. We have to recognize that the Lord is the one who's holding everything up. We have to sleep, and when we do, the world keeps spinning. It doesn't stop because we're not there. And it's the same for each of us, and we have to be willing to accept his help. And that means accepting the help of the people around us, because he puts them there, because we are to be here for one another. You know, the situation that Dad and Zach and I are in right now, that's the sort of thing where we have to be willing to look to the people that we have to deal with that, because we can't carry it on our own. And another thing that we do want to take away from this would probably be considered kind of the big takeaway, I would think, of this particular passage, is just being careful what you wish for. I like to talk about how God is not a genie, and he's not. Sometimes he will grant wishes, and then we'll wish that he hadn't. We want things that are more of a curse than a blessing, and God might just let you have it. But the more we focus on pursuing his will and being thankful for his provision, then the less likely we are to fall into this trap by asking for things that are no good for us. Just have to do the work that he calls us to, not thinking that we can rely on ourselves or that he will fail, because that's a path to destruction that we want to stay off of. By remembering that God's arm is long, because that's where he asks Moses there, is God's arm weak? Another way of translating that is God's arm shortened? It's not. He still had the same reach. Moses expresses doubt of that in verse 21 and 22, but it's actually interesting because you find a similar comment coming from some other followers of God in Mark chapter 6, verses 35 to 44 that we'll read here. Because it says, when the day was now far spent, Christ's disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Send them away that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat." But he answered and said to them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?" But he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. So he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in ranks, in hundreds and in 50s, and when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish he divided among them all. So they all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fish. Now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. The disciples basically had the same question that Moses did. How is this supposed to happen? Because they weren't trusting that God could do exactly what he said he could do. And in this case, actually, with the Christ's feeding the 5,000, this was purposefully modeled on the idea of the manna and of the quail. He's pointing back to that experience in order to really proclaim himself as the same God who had worked that miracle previously, to show his power, to show his authority, and to show his care, his provision, that he was there to sustain his people. Well, neither the manna and the quail, nor the loaves and the fish compared to the great life-giving miracle of all, the resurrection, where Jesus came down in order to live our life and then die our death, to pay the penalty for our sin, but then to rise to life again in order to show that the payment was actually accepted and that we could be forgiven. That was what he made possible. We know that. That was God's power on display more than in anything else. And his power has not grown less. So we have to trust him to do what he says he will, even when we're going through hard places. We just have to keep praying. Keep praying for ourselves, and then also praying for the people around us. Again, Moses falls short of that here. He does it in verse 2, but not by the time he gets to verse 33. And once more, I don't know that I would have been either. It is very difficult, but we're not supposed to give up on people like that. It's not Moses' example that we're supposed to follow. It's Jesus. Jesus who speaks in Matthew chapter 5, verse 44, and says to love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. It was what he said, and then it was what he did. Because in Luke chapter 23, verse 34, on the cross, he prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." We are supposed to intercede like that, even for difficult people, especially for difficult people, because they need it. And then we just stop there, because like Israel, we're supposed to keep moving forward. That's what they do at the end of the chapter. In spite of everything that happens, they were still on the way to the promised land. God was still guiding them. They could keep going. We need to keep going too. We can't just sit around and wallow in the graveyards of our pasts. We need to step out of that. That's what we're here to do, is to call people out of that. Anybody who comes to this church or watches the sermons online, or that we go out and speak to tell them that the life that you are living is no life at all. And that's what Christ is calling you out of, asking you to leave behind, because it's crazy to stay in it. No less crazy than it was for the Israelites to look back fondly on Egypt. Come out by accepting what he offers, having faith in him, believing in the power of his resurrection, because if you do, he will truly sustain you. And Christians, don't let the world bring you down and make your blessings stick in your mouth. And don't look back with nostalgia goggles on. Know that the Lord is giving you what you need. And then in that knowledge, share it with those who need it too. We have to let them know the journey has an end, one way or another. It's either in the grave or it's in the promised land. The only way to make it home is by following the Lord.